Hey guys, and welcome back. Now today we're going to be talking about the differences and similarities between the Minolta X-700 and the Canon AE-1 program, and which one is right for you and your needs. And we'll also get to how, unfortunately, I hate to admit it, the AE-1 program came out on top. So if you're new to the channel, what we talk about is mainly film photography, but we do talk about travel and then just kind of whatever I feel like doing. So if you're interested in that, make sure you hit that subscribe button, like, comment down below, and say hi. Now let's get into this comparison. So first, we're gonna go over similarities, what these cameras have in common. Then we'll talk about the differences as far as functions and quality, things like that. And of course, I'll show you examples I've shot with both of these cameras along the way. And then lastly, we will go over how the Canon AE-1 program kind of beat out the Minolta X-700. I say kind of because I still prefer the X-700. So first of all, both of these cameras have a split image focusing in the center, surrounded by micro prism around that. And also those focusing screens are interchangeable, but it's not quite easy. Of course, you'd have to take off all the top compartments and everything. Very different from, say, a Nikon F, F2, F3, F4, where you can just kind of pop the top off and pull it out and put a different focusing screen in. Nevertheless, they are still interchangeable. Also, these are both interchangeable SLR cameras, meaning that they are single lens reflex cameras with an interchangeable lens system. On that note, they both offer a very wide variety of lenses to go along with the system. I believe the Minolta X-700 was produced from the early 80s all the way till 2000, whereas the AE-1 program was produced from the early 80s till about 88, I think. Don't quote me on those and don't get freaked out if I got the dates a little off. Nevertheless, this is one of Canon's most popular cameras with the FD mount, and the X-700, of course, since it was produced for such a long period of time, and there are endless lenses that you could use for the system. They're both metal bayonet locking mounts as well. Slight difference is that the X-700 has a button on the camera to dismount the lens, whereas the AE-1 program has a button on the actual lens that you press in order to dismount from the body. Both have half press metering, which means if you press the shutter button down halfway, it's going to show you the metering for your lighting conditions. Both of these cameras have a cloth shutter that has a flash sync of 1/60th of a second, and both of them have a shutter speed that goes up to 1/1000th of a second. However, the X-700 goes down to 1 second, the AE-1 program goes down to a 2-second exposure, but they do both offer a bulb mode. And then lastly, they have both program and manual functions. Also, I almost forgot, both of these cameras have a on and off, and then a on with sound. On the X-700, it's a little dial next to the shutter speed, so green with the sound waves is of course on with sound, red, actually just black off is off, and then green on is just your standard on. The AE-1 program has a little lever here, which is a little bit easier. It doesn't look quite as good as the X-700, but it's got A for auto, L for lock, and then S for sound. And all that is packed into these cameras, which does require batteries for both of them, meaning that they will not function in any way, shape, or form without a battery in them. The batteries are different, which brings us into our differences for these two cameras. The Minolta X-700 takes two CR44 batteries, which of course go into the bottom of the camera. Use a coin, pop that out, put the batteries in, and you're good to go. Whereas the AE-1 program uses one LR44 battery that is really annoying. And not only that, it mounts in the front of the camera, which is cool, and it wouldn't be as bad if it wasn't for that these doors are notorious for just snapping and breaking off and just kind of ruining the aesthetic of the camera because they just don't hold up very well. It's just cheap plastic and it just kind of falls apart. Other than that, it is very convenient to take out the battery of the AE-1 program versus that of the X-700, which you really don't need to since the batteries for both of these will last you a year plus easily, depending of course on how much you use it. Minor differences in aesthetic, of course, the X-700 being all black, which I kind of prefer, and the AE-1 program by Canon of course has that classic vintage look that every Instagrammer ever uses for all of their feed, which is probably part of the reason I don't like the AE-1 program as much. As far as film advance goes, the X-700 is a very smooth advance on that. It just feels right, and it's the right tension all the way through, and it's just a smooth click. The AE-1 programs, for some reason, all of them, they tend to be a little jerky. They're very easy up front, and then it kind of just catches at the end. Of course, this one does have that infamous Canon squeak, which is kind of annoying. Yeah, that needs to be fixed. As far as build quality goes, they're pretty much the same. Not a whole lot of differences in that aspect of it. I will say that personally, I have noticed I get more electronic issues with the X700, and bodies that I found were just the inner electronics are just fried, and I still haven't troubleshot that and taken them apart. Whereas the AE-1 program, I haven't really seen any issues with that, and I believe it tends to hold up a little bit better long term. I will say, however, this is known, of course, for that infamous squeak you get from the shutter. But again, that is an easy fix, and it doesn't prohibit you from using the camera in the short term. Another thing as far as aesthetic, I love that the X700 has that nice little grip on the back of the film door for your hand, just kind of feels right. And then also it has that on the front as well. And then with the AE-1 program, you don't have it on the back, which is fine. And then on the front, you do have the option to put a little grip on there. That's optional. You can put it on or you can take it off. So depending on what you find, it may or may not have that little grip on there. It's kind of a cool little thing that you can put on and off, but I give the X700 the edge on that. All right, so we're getting towards the bigger differences here. So here we go. So as I said before, both of these cameras have a full automatic mode as well as manual functions. Now for the X700, all you have to do is switch the shutter speed dial to P for program, and then on the lens, what you do is you go to the highest aperture, which on this lens is f/16. Highest aperture. Some would say the smallest aperture because the hole is smallest. It can get confusing if you're not familiar with it. But this lens actually is not capable of doing that. How I know is because that number should be in green if this lens is capable of a program mode. This is not. This goes up to 16, and so it is not capable of full program mode. So that's something to look out for if you're going to use that feature. Now with the Canon AE-1 program, you put the shutter dial to, of course, program, and then on the lens, you turn it all the way till the A. You're going to press this little button and rotate it until you get to that. And that puts the camera on full automatic function. Now some of you might be thinking, well, what happens if I don't want to use the automatic function on the X700, but I need to shoot at f/16? Well, that's where one of the big differences comes in between these cameras. So the X700 is a aperture priority camera, meaning that you can put the shutter dial on A, and it will choose the shutter speed that correlates to whatever aperture you pick. So if I want to pick f/16, I can, and if it's on A, it will not automatically select the aperture for me. As well as if I decide to shoot it manual and put my shutter speed on 1/250, I can also select 16, and it's not going to do that as an automatic function where it would select the aperture for me. It only works that way if you're on the program mode of the shutter speed dial, as well as that on the lens. This is a shutter priority camera, meaning you can put the lens on A, and then you can pick the shutter speed. It doesn't work the other way though, where you can put the shutter speed on program and then select your own shutter speed. So that part really comes down to personal preference. I know for street photography, a lot of times you want to shoot with a high aperture, so you make sure you get your subject in focus. But there are some times where maybe you want to shoot with a high shutter speed so that your subject isn't blurry as it's moving by. It really kind of just depends on personal preference. So that's where the big difference comes down between the cameras. A lot of people prefer aperture priority, but of course a lot of people like the ease of use and all the functions of the Canon AE-1 program. So that's a big difference in making your decision between these two cameras. Next up, of course, is there is an ASA dial on both of the film rewind knobs on each of these cameras. However, the X700 has a dedicated exposure compensation dial, whereas the AE-1 program does not. Both of these cameras have auto exposure lock buttons, but they function a little bit differently. So on the X700, it is right where the shutter speed is. There's a knob there, you press that down, and that is your auto exposure lock. On the AE-1 program, it is located over on the film rewind side of the camera, and it's a little black button by the lens. The big difference is with the X700, once you have your composition and you hit that auto exposure lock, you can't adjust your settings. If you want to make changes, you'd have to compose your exposure somewhere else and then lock it and then get your composition in order. With the AE-1 program, you have the option to change the settings as you're composing your shot, which isn't a huge deal, honestly. That's not something I use a whole lot since mainly I shoot manual. But again, if that's something that's a big deal breaker for you, maybe you go with the AE-1 program, or if it's not an issue, maybe you go with the X-700, since it does of course have the exposure compensation dial built into it, which some people like, some people don't like. This one is very easy to use, so I don't mind it really at all on the X-700. And then the last few things we're going to talk about are the viewfinders, and then the big difference in the prisms, which kind of separates the AE-1 program, making it on paper better than the X-700. So for the viewfinders, with the AE-1 program, it will tell you on the right-hand side what mode you're shooting in, and then it will give you the shutter speeds, and then show you lit up the exact aperture that you have selected. It's all LEDs, it's nice, it's a cool feature to have. And as far as viewfinders go, it is one of the bigger ones there are available. The X-700, I think, is pretty much about the same as far as the size of the viewfinder in the Canon 1 program, but it functions a little bit differently. If you look, the face of the X-700 sticks out over the lens. The reason for that is just underneath the Minolta insignia, there is a little mirror, and that mirror goes down onto the aperture on the lens. So as you hold it up to your face, you can look dead ahead, and on the bottom you will see the aperture you're currently on, and then on the right hand side it will show you the modes you're in, and then it shows you all the shutter speeds just in white, and then there's a red LED next to the shutter speed that it thinks you should select. And under that as well, it will also tell you if you have exposure compensation turned on, plus or minus. So now we've come to the reason that the AE-1 program kind of goes above and beyond the X-700. So I shot with the X-700 at the fair recently. I put this fancy little triple split prism weird looking thing. Well, I get that light in there, you go. It was fun, it was cool, it was very different. You'll see those images of course throughout this. But in shooting at night at the fair, I pushed Portra 400 to 1600 so that I had plenty of light and didn't have to worry about that. And then I just put the camera on automatic and let it do its thing. Now I can't say for certain if it was the X-700's fault. I'm gonna have to go back and shoot this in manual to see if maybe there is an issue with the timing of the shutter, or if I just or maybe there's a curtain issue, so I'll check this in broad daylight as well. But I developed my film and I discovered that most of the shots were significantly underexposed, to which I really couldn't understand why. The lighting was great. I mean, I shot a lot of the bright neon signs and things like that, so I just couldn't figure out why that was the case. So the light meter in the X-700 is pretty much evenly split 50-50 between the center of the image and the exterior of the image, meaning it's not going to choose the center of the image as your predominant exposure point. So if you have a very bright back and then a very dark center, then it's going to split the difference and shoot about 50-50. The AE-1 program is center weighted. I'm not sure exactly what it is. I'm assuming it's about a 60-40, which tends to be the case for most of these cameras. So your composition is in the center. It's going to center weight your light meter in order to kind of ensure that the center of the image is properly exposed. On top of that, I read that the light meters in the X-700 do not perform well at night at all. Of course, I read this afterwards. And in my research, I discovered that it tends to lead towards the faster shutter speed and also the smaller aperture. So of course, it's gonna let less light in that way. Also, I saw that with this light meter, it tends to be about 1/4 of a second too fast, which again is going to reduce the amount of light that comes into the X-700. And that is how I discovered that the AE-1 program on paper is better than the Minolta X-700. Is it a big deal? It really depends on your shooting style. For me, I don't think it's significant. That just means I have to shoot manual with this camera and kind of take in those factors in shooting any night photography that I do with the X-700. Whereas if I decide to go with the AE-1 program, it performs much better at night. I can kind of put this on full auto and let it do its thing. With the X-700, you have the exposure compensation dial and things like that, and you of course can use an external light meter to ensure that you get the proper settings on that camera. But that is something to take into consideration depending on what your needs are. So I hope you enjoyed this little video on the main differences between the X-700 and the AE-1 program. Let me know which one you go with down below. I like the X-700 despite its slight faults, but it does get a leg up for the aperture priority as opposed to the shutter priority of the Canon AE-1 program. So make sure you comment down below, like if you found this video useful anyway, and make sure you subscribe for future videos as well. And I will see you in the next one.